Good morning and welcome to the COVID-19 Vaccines and Cancer event presented by the Global Cancer Coalitions Network. My name is Alex Filicheves and I'm the Executive Director of the World Bladder Cancer Patient Coalition, a proud member of the Global Cancer Coalitions Network. The GCCN is an informal network we've established in May 2020 in response to concerns about the impact of COVID-19 on member organizations and the communities that they serve. And collectively, we represent some 750 cancer patient advocacy and support organizations who are working on behalf of over 14 million patients around the world. Today, based on our community feedback and feedback received from our last event on World Cancer Day earlier this year, we will focus today on COVID-19 vaccines and cancer. And our event is divided into two parts. So we will begin with a panel discussion where over the course of an hour, our experts will answer your questions about the COVID-19 vaccines through the lens of cancer care. We have received some questions from our audience in advance already, but please feel free to ask additional questions in the Q&A panel located on the right-hand side of your screen. I will then aim to bring those into our discussion today with the panelists. Now, the second portion of our event will feature three member experiences covering overcoming vaccine hesitancy in racialized and immigrant communities, dispelling COVID-19 vaccine myths, and an overview of the results of a recent COVID-19 vaccine and brain tumor patient survey. So first, it is my pleasure to introduce our expert panel. In brief, detailed biographies you can find in the info section on the right-hand side, which is where you will also find the link to the simultaneous live translation. So make sure to explore those if you would prefer to follow the discussions in another language. So joining us today are four panelists: Dr. Luis Grasa. He's a professor of immunology at the University of Lisbon and also a co-chair of the National Technical Advisory Committee for the COVID-19 vaccine in Portugal. Dr. Evandro de Azambuja, oncologist and head of medical support team located at the Jules Bordet Institute in Brussels, Belgium. Dr. Nicole Lamana is Associate Clinical Professor of Medicine in the Hematologic Malignancies section of the Hematology Oncology Division at New York Presbyterian Columbia University Medical Center in the United States. And lastly, Dr. Alison Farmer, who is a psycho-oncology clinical nurse at the University Hospital Southampton in the United Kingdom. So welcome and thank you so much for donating your time to join the panel today and to answer some of the pressing questions that come through from our community. But before we dive into discussion, we also wanted to start the day with a quick poll. And so if we could just bring that poll up on the screen, and I invite you to share your responses with us. Our poll will be on your vaccination status. So you should be able to see it on the screen now. And we thought it would be a nice way to start the discussion today to see where our community is and the audience today when it comes to vaccination, whether you have had one or two shots and whether you haven't and what could be the reasons for that as well. You should be able to see that on your screen at the moment. And we'll give it about a minute or so before we bring up your answers to the screen. And I think this will give us a nice way into a discussion then knowing where our audiences are. And I would like to remind you at the same time while we're waiting that there is a Q&A box to the right-hand side of your screen. So you can click on that and you will be able to ask the questions directly to our panel, which I will do my best to bring in as part of our discussion today. In addition to the questions that we have received already in advance, and we have quite so many, so that is really wonderful. So if you haven't had a chance yet to answer, please answer now. Are you fully vaccinated? Yes or no? And if you could tell us if you haven't yet, what may have been the reason for that. I'll just check now whether we can bring in the results on the screen already. Wonderful. So we see the responses coming in, and the vast majority of you currently are fully vaccinated. That's 88% right now. And I think the responses are still coming in. We do have some respondents who have shared as well, no. Some of you are waiting for more data to come in. And also you have had, some of you had first shot of the 2-shot series, but still waiting to go. All right, so I think this gives a nice intro for us and our panelists to see where we are with our audience in terms of vaccination. So now I would like to then jump into our discussion. And we've received, as I've mentioned, some questions in advance already, but please feel free to share your questions throughout the discussion and to enrich our conversations today. So we've learned that communication is an important part of increasing awareness and fighting hesitancy, especially, I think. And Dr. Dazambuja, I would go to you first, as I think Belgium as well is a great example of where maybe we have started slow, but have seen greater results overall in time. So my first question to you would be, how can we improve our communications when it comes to vaccine awareness, and whether you're aware of any best practices, whether they be from Belgium or anywhere else in the world?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for this question, Alex. Indeed, Belgium started very slow with the vaccination campaign, but then picked it up quite fast. And now you are starting to vaccinate the third dose of people. So I just got mine yesterday, so I'm completely fine. I think the most important thing is to give reliable scientific information to people, to doctors, to nurses, to pharmacists, to the cancer patients with cancer, because you know that those patients, they are more at the risk of COVID-19 infection, more severe. They have a higher mortality, you have shown in some studies. And I think it is important that the national cancer societies and the international cancer societies, they are aligned in the same language, how to translate the benefit of giving vaccination to our patients, why they should get the first dose, the second dose, and now the third dose. Because the pandemic we are now in Belgium, the fourth wave. The numbers are increasing again. Some countries are back in lockdown, like Austria. Netherlands is partially in lockdown. So I think that's important that the scientific community really get together using news. Webinars like this one that you are doing today is very informative. The European Society for Medical Oncology have done one webinar dedicated to COVID-19 vaccines. And I think that's where you have to get the most information. I would recommend avoiding like Facebook groups that sometimes people who goes to those groups, they had bad experience. They had more severe symptoms, sometimes with the vaccine. So I would avoid that. I would go for more reliable scientific information.
Thank you. And Dr. Grassa, I have the same question to you as well. In your view, how can we improve our communications when it comes to vaccine awareness? Dr. Grassi, you're on mute at the moment.
Of course, something needs to start wrong, even after all the preparation. But thank you for the invitation to participate in this panel. I think that we live in a world where information is easily accessible, but this also leads to the risk that the quality of this information is not always the same. And I think it would be very important to transmit the confidence in the institutions that are overseeing the implementation of vaccines as a source of reliable information. I have been fortunate and privileged to carry this process of vaccination within a vaccine committee that reviews the technical evidence regarding the safety and efficacy of the vaccines in order to define the best way to implement these vaccines to provide the best efficacy and in the safest way to the population. And this has been a humbling experience by working in a group of people that are very competent in different technical disciplines in assessing this complex data that arises from different countries. And it is also important to stress that different countries collaborate in sharing this information and the assessment. And this then leads to policies that are implemented by the health authorities in the different countries. And I think that it is important to transmit the confidence that there are experts working in these complex issues to try to bring this information towards an effective and safe implementation of vaccines. And the best source of information is through the official health institutions that are coordinating the vaccine process in the different countries.
Thank you, Dr. Grass. And I think there's some great insights from you and Dr. Dzambuja already. Dr. Lamana, any thoughts on how we can improve our communications when it comes to vaccine awareness, but maybe perhaps even more so within our patient communities?
Yeah, I mean, you know, in New York, we've seen a real shift from the beginning of the pandemic to now, and I think that's because we really started to seeing a decrease in the amount of hospitalizations, and this was really proof that these vaccines have been so effective and really keeping patients out of the hospital, you know, from being with severe illness. And I think working through patient organizations, so I've been doing a lot of discussions with patient advocacy groups just to kind of have those open forums like this, to have patients ask questions, and there's been educational sessions that we've done here at the hospital for the New York City community at large, particularly because we do have such a mix of multicultural patients from all over the world, and then trying to get to different communities as of such. So we've held a lot of educational sessions here at the center just to try to disparage some of these different views about the vaccine, just to prove safety as well as efficacy. So we could really kind of, you know, disparage a lot of the, as someone had put it earlier, some of the experiences that may not be valid. And so I think that it behooves us to do a lot more educational activities for patients, so we can really talk about their concerns and really ensure that, you know, the vaccines have more than one purpose. It is obviously not to just decrease the severity of the actual COVID illness, but to decrease spread among other patients and decrease mutations that may arise along the way, the more and quicker we can get vaccinations available to all.
Thank you. And Dr. Farmer, I think as a psycho-oncology clinical nurse, from your perspective, when it comes to this, what are some ways we can maybe convince those who are unvaccinated to get the shot?
Okay, I would agree with everything the doctors have said. It's important that we look at why some patients with cancer aren't accepting vaccination. And the top 3 reasons are fear of side effects, questioning the effectiveness of the vaccine, and questioning whether it's safe for cancer patients. So I think we really need to be aware of what the main reasons are for people not having the vaccination and address those. It's interesting that the way we frame the communication is really important. So positive framing is really important. So we talk about vaccines being 90% effective rather than 10% failure rate. And also some of the literature has shown that having the communication delivered by a senior doctor is very important for our oncology patients. So those are sort of the ways we can improve the communication. I think it's really important to be aware that there are many, many different reasons people are hesitant to have the vaccine, and there will be a group of patients who are inherently afraid or distrusting of authority figures like politicians, doctors, and certainly in the UK, during the height of the pandemic, when we were in the middle of all the waves, the communication was given each evening by 3 white men in suits. And for people who distrust that group, then we need to think outside the box. Who else can we use to promote vaccine uptake? I think we haven't been flexible enough in that area. So there are just some thoughts there, is to use different forms of communication, different people.
Thank you. So I think that's a nice way of important starting point for us to really think about how we talk and how we communicate about COVID vaccines. Now, Dr. Grassa, I think this question comes up a lot, and I would like to put this to you. If a patient has already had COVID-19, should they be vaccinated anyway?
We know that the vaccination of people that have recovered from infection is safe. It has been done many times in many different countries for us to be confident that it is safe to receive a vaccine if someone had an infection before. We also know that this vaccination of someone that recovered from infection gives an extra degree of protection that reduces the likelihood from getting infection later and reduces the likelihood from getting complications later. So it is certainly recommended for someone that have recovered from COVID-19 to be vaccinated.
Thank you. And Dr. Dzambuja, are there any of those with cancer who should not get the vaccine at all? And if so, why?
Yeah, for the moment, you cannot exclude the patients for the vaccination. So I think most of the patients they are going to receive having cancer and being on active treatment, we know that they are at more risk for the disease. So they are recommended to get vaccines unless there is a allergic reaction that you know from previous vaccine, and unless there is a real clear medical contraindication for that, but this is very uncommon. So I recommend it to almost all my patients unless there is really a clear contraindication. I think it's important to know, and I think we're going to discuss later about the treatments, how they affect the vaccines, and I'll leave this to later.
Thank you. And I would like to bring in as well a question that we have received already from the audience here today, asking about whether a history of cancer means you're at a higher risk of more severe COVID complications. I would like to open this to the group, whoever would like to answer, maybe Dr. Grassa or Dzambuja.
I can say that cancer is a very heterogeneous group of pathologies, and the risk differs from patients with different types of cancer at different stages of the disease and submitted to different therapies. I think that overall, people with cancer can be considered as a group of patients that have a greater likelihood from develop complications, and it is advised that patients with cancer get protection from vaccination whenever this is recommended, as Dr. Dzambuja has suggested.
Yeah, I completely agree with Dr. Luis Grassa. So we did a study here in Belgium. You look for patients with solid tumors compared to those patients without cancer, solid tumors, who were in hospital because of COVID-19, and you see a higher mortality rate for those patients. And this has been demonstrated in many countries like in the UK, United States, different studies for solid cancer, for hematological disease, but not only for active cancer, but patients with cancer who have been treated in the past, they are also at a higher risk. So the recommendation is to vaccinate everyone in active treatments or without treatments.
Thank you. And Dr. Lamanna, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I want to echo that, particularly, even so I specialize in hematologic malignancies and blood cancers, and even patients who were on observation and monitoring for their hematologic malignancies, we saw a higher morbidity mortality in our chronic leukemia population, which echoes that statement tremendously. I mean, I think it does depend on for solid tumor malignancies, how far away somebody might have been diagnosed or treated. And I think that varies, and it is very heterogeneous, and you need to speak to your physician to get a better sense of where you are on that spectrum of your journey. But there was no doubt that even patients who weren't on active therapy, particularly for the blood cancers, that we saw an increased morbidity and mortality, and all the more reason for patients to be vaccinated with cancer.
Thank Thank you. And, Dr. Farmer, you've touched about general communication and awareness from kind of psychological point of view, and recognizing that there are many levels of uncertainty and fear for cancer patients regarding COVID vaccines. Any suggestions on how we could, allay these fears and reassure them as well in the safety of the vaccines?
Well, I think, as I said before, I wish there was one size fits all, but people have, so many different reasons why they're not accepting the vaccine. So beliefs, personality, biases, age, gender, income. So we have to sort of look at why people are vaccine hesitant and then address that particular issue. So many different approaches to how we can encourage people to accept the vaccine. Some of the most successful are reminders and recall. So when we offer people a vaccine, sometimes people think, oh yes, their intention is to take up the vaccine, but they then put the letter aside, and just having a reminder and a recall can really help. Presumptive announcements, so saying to people, you are due your COVID vaccine. When you come in for your appointment, you will receive it. Those have been shown to be quite effective. And we need to make it easy for our oncology patients. So one of the issues, for example, with the Pfizer vaccine was because it is so fragile, we couldn't move it around to the patients. So making it easy for the patients to have it, maybe not do it in a hospital if they're nervous about coming to the hospital. So there are a number of ways we can actually make it easier for them. With oncology patients, fear of needles is really, really common for people that have had a long-term treatment. We need to sort of be supporting people with that fear. And I think most important is to be non-judgmental and use empathy, validate those fears and see how we can help encourage the patients gently to actually get the vaccination, because, we know it is really important.
Thank you. And, Dr. Grassa, I'm going to come back to you now, talking about specific impact of COVID vaccines. And we have received a question from one of the participants, whether there is a possibility that the COVID-19 vaccine would make the immunosuppressed sicker.
Thanks for that question, because I think it is important to clarify some of these misunderstandings regarding the effects of COVID-19 vaccines. All the vaccines that are authorized for use in at least in Europe and North America are vaccines that are very safe for people that are immune deficient. They do not have live viruses, and as a consequence, they will not lead to infection or any consequence of the vaccine itself. In addition, the patients with reduced immunity, such as the immune-suppressed patients, are in fact in greater risk for complications of infection. And this is a group of patients that would benefit the most from vaccination. In some cases, it is necessary to have a strategy for vaccination that may differ slightly from the people that do not have immune diseases. They may need an additional dose to reach the same level of protection as people that have a normal immune system. But certainly, from all the experience that we have gathered in the vaccination of many patients with immune suppression, there is no evidence that harm is caused by the vaccine to the health of these patients.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grassa, for clarifying that. Dr. Lamana, speaking of treatments, can someone in active treatment with chemotherapy receive the COVID-19 vaccine? That's one of the questions that came up quite a lot as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that clearly what we're trying to learn is that we know, and we know this from other vaccinations for our cancer patients in general, our biggest concern, which was already mentioned, was whether or not what is the type of immune response that will develop on patients on active therapy. So even though most of us willingly will give vaccinations to our patients on active therapy, what we're learning about is, we know this from, as I said, even the influenza vaccine and pneumococcal vaccines, that not everybody will mount the same immune response while they're on treatment, depending upon the type of therapy that one is getting. It doesn't mean that somebody shouldn't get the vaccine, but we're trying to learn what may be the most effective way to, give an additional immune response to the COVID vaccine, whether that be an additional vaccine, an alternative vaccine. So this is something we're learning as we go along with the pandemic, and as we're learning more about the vaccines and how the immune response is in patients with cancer. And so it is safe to get during chemotherapy. And I think even a little protection is better than no protection. We're also learning that despite some of the tests that we might be running upon where one is, that there are probably arms of the immune system that aren't being able to be tested. And we're learning that now, now that we are doing lots of studies, both clinical and laboratory investigations, that are investigating the immune system response, particularly in patients with cancer and who are on various therapies, to show that there are probably other arms of our immune system that probably are having a response to these vaccines, despite some of the mainstream testing that is currently available. And so I think it is important that patients get vaccinated while on therapy. We will learn more about how to maybe better have these vaccines be more effective to our patients with cancer along the way, again, with either alternative vaccines or with additional vaccine administration along the way, so we can try to properly really get an adequate response on patients depending upon the therapies that they're currently on.
Thank you, Dr. Lamana. And Dr. Dzambuja, as well, as a follow-up question, what about those that receive other active lines of treatment that Dr. Lamana has mentioned already? And for example, radiation was one of them that come up in the questions from the audience earlier.
Yeah, for the moment, we recommend the vaccine to all patients with active treatments. It can be chemotherapy, immunotherapy, can be chemoimmunotherapy, radiotherapy, endocrine therapy. So we do not make a distinction on the treatment. So we do not stop the treatment. We try to put the vaccine in the most convenient timing of the treatment. For those who are not on active treatment yet, you're going to start, we recommend to start prior to the treatment to give the vaccine. For those on active treatment already, we try to see the best moment to give the vaccine. But we do not preclude vaccine from any active cancer treatment at this moment. But like Dr. Lamana mentioned, we know that with some treatments, maybe the protection is not 100% like we expected, is less. And that's why you have to look for boosting, giving the third dose, or looking for alternatives.
Mm-hmm. And I see that there were some questions from the audience live at the moment as well, whether there has been any guidance on whether people or when or whether people should get a vaccine in relation to their treatment, and whether the treatment should stop. So I think from what I understand, generally, there is no recommendation that the active treatment should be paused whilst receiving a vaccine.
Yeah, indeed, this is our recommendation. We don't pause. We just try to fit the vaccine in the best moment of the treatment. Like if it's chemotherapy, 3 weeks interval, we try to give for the next cycle, that you know that the recovered from the blood, the white blood cells decreases, higher is back. So that's the moment you try to do the vaccine.
Thank you. And Dr. Farmer, how do you reassure the patients and their families when dealing with a kind of vaccine during the active treatment, and some of the concerns that they might have of impact of each to each other?
Sorry, what do you mean by impact to each other?
So the impact of the vaccine on the treatment and vice versa.
Okay, so I think what it's important to emphasize is that the patient's oncologist would have done a very careful risk-benefit analysis and would do whatever was in the patient's best interest. I think those fears are understandable, and we should listen and validate those fears, but offer whatever reassurance we can that the doctors again would have, be doing something in their best interest, and make extra appointments available if necessary. Most oncologists would be happy to have a telephone consultation with the patient if they need some more reassurance. So that's what we would do, is offer them access to their oncology team to discuss it again if necessary.
Thank you. And so we will jump very briefly to another poll question. But before we bring it up the screen and set it up, I just wanted to share one question just to the group and see it's open question to anyone who wants to answer. And I think this comes up a lot in general. Should cancer patients receive a specific COVID vaccine? I think in any specific brand and stuff. Anyone would like to tackle this one? Maybe Dr. Lamanna, you.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that, first and foremost, I think it's important to get vaccinated, period. And I think that, depending upon the availability of which vaccine is in your region, I think it's most important to get that vaccine. I think there are shortages depending upon location and supply and demand issues, which make, waiting for a particular brand not really a smart move. I think it's more important to get the vaccine that's available for you, because, as we learn, and we've been learning, I think many of these vaccines have effectiveness across the board. And so I think rather than choosing a particular or waiting for a particular brand, I think is not really safe for the patient, given the risk-benefit ratio of getting vaccinated in the first place. As we've noted, there might be some benefit of getting more than one different vaccine, and we're going to be learning about that across the cancer population. But I think that it's more important to get a vaccine that's available in your area.
Thank you, Dr. Lamanna. And I think it reminds me of that message when we started vaccination campaigns. Generally, to the general population, the best vaccine is the one that you can get your hands on, right? So we should be able to bring up our next poll, before we continue our discussion. So we just pause here for a brief moment. We wanted to know, for those of you who have been vaccinated, what is life like for you now? So the poll should pop up for you on the screen very briefly. And we will have about a minute or so to answer this before we dive back in. And so the question is, since becoming fully vaccinated, have you continued a social distancing or wearing a face mask, attended social gatherings, hugged close friends or family that do not reside with you, and felt more comfortable restarting medical appointments in person as well? You can choose all of the answers that apply to you. And we will be coming to see them on the main screen very shortly. And I think one of the, from bladder cancer patient community that I work very closely with, we always have heard that, especially in the countries where self-isolation was actively encouraged. And I don't remember now the term that they have used in the UK. Maybe Dr. Farmer might help me with that. Self-isolation or shielding, there you go. That was quite unique to the UK, but that really our patient community missed that human contact and missed that ability, to spend, see, or hug friends and family. So we're very interested to know how those in the audience today have been able to restart some of these activities, maybe depending on whether they have received the vaccine and depending on situation in their country, because we do see them changing. I know in Belgium, things have changed very quickly and drastically more recently, and I'm sure that is also have seen across Europe and across the world. Okay, could we bring up the results and on the screen? I'm just gonna quickly look at them. So we see that most of you were able to Okay, you have continued social distancing and wearing a face masks, and that is really wonderful to hear. I think that's one of the most effective ways, right? But we're able to also hug close friends and family who do not reside with you. And as these were all tick all that apply, I think many had opportunities to also attend social gatherings and felt more comfortable restarting medical appointments in person, as about 60% of those. Well, thank you so much for sharing your answers with us and helping us understand better the situations in your countries and your personal situations as well. And I'd like to dive back into our discussions. And I will have a look as well at some of the questions that are coming in live now. But first, Dr. Farmer, one of the questions we received in advance was that some cancer patients experience, another layer of anxiety, and I think that's a recurring theme across different areas when it comes to treatment. But the anxiety about going to the hospital and the potential exposure to COVID-19, how should we address that anxiety, maybe from medical point of view, but maybe also from patient advocacy and caregivers as well? Any suggestions, recommendations you might share?
It's such an understandable anxiety, because certainly in the UK, when COVID first hit, we sent every cancer patient a letter saying you have to shield. And people were literally barricaded in their spare bedroom, not eating with their family, not hugging with their children, irrespective of their cancers and what treatment they were having. So it was a blanket approach here. And that did quite a lot of psychological damage. That shielding letter has made people very nervous. And the hospital has been presented as this sort of scary place full of COVID. And people were encouraged not to attend initially by health professionals and family and friends. And so we actually saw our inpatient numbers decrease dramatically in the first wave. Our oncology wards were about a third full. It was incredible. So that fear is understandable. I think what it's important to relay now is that how we manage COVID in the hospitals. So it's probably one of the safest places to go, certainly safer than a supermarket. It's wiped down within an inch of its life. The COVID patients are very isolated in different parts of the hospital. The staff are in full PPE all the time. We're also, in our oncology area, we're tested twice a week. So emphasize the safety of the hospital. I think remote consultation has pros and cons, but for many patients, it's been a really good thing that we have brought in remote consultation. So can we offer that remote consultation if that's possible and people are really keen to do that? So I think really just reassure where possible, discuss their fears, maybe dispel some myths about coming to the hospital. And, if necessary, allow them to bring someone. We've been quite inflexible in many areas about allowing a loved one to come with a patient, but I think there are some times when actually we have to say, okay, bring a relative for support or a friend. For psychological reasons, I would support that.
And that can have a really huge impact on addressing the anxiety of patients, right? Dr. Dzambuja, how can we, if we can just jump now more to the treatment side of things, how can the various vaccines affect cancer patients' conditions?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't think the vaccines per se, they affect the cancer health or the cancer status of the tumor, how the tumor is progressing or responding to treatment. There is no interference with the disease course, okay? We've seen, I'm a breast cancer specialist, we've seen that some patients, when they have the vaccine, they have some lymph nodes in the axillary area. And for us, sometimes the patients have the vaccine and then they come to us 2 to 3 weeks later and you palpate some lymph nodes, and then creates a little bit of anxiety to the patient. But this is totally inflammatory reaction now, and you just follow up this patient for a few months and it goes away. So we change our recommendation of doing mammogram, like the routine mammogram for those patients, to have at least 4 months period from the vaccine until the mammogram, just to avoid observing this amount of lymph nodes. But for the rest, I don't see any interference with a patient health or disease states.
Thank you. And I see also a related question from the audience right now saying, does the panel know of any formal studies or trials that are being undertaken at the moment, specifically looking at cancer patients and COVID-19 vaccines?
Yes, Alex, if I may continue on that. So there are a lot of studies looking for the efficacy of vaccine. They have some systematic reviews now looking either for the efficacy after the first dose or after the second dose. And we are planning here in Belgium, we are starting about in 1 or 2 weeks' time. We are really addressing this question, looking for patients who had the second dose 6 months ago and now are up to the third dose. So we're going to do a blood test prior to the third dose, give the injection 2 weeks later, and then do a second blood test 2 weeks later and 6 months later, just to see how is the immune response to the third dose of vaccine. There are many studies planning or is about to start on this, but here in Belgium, we're doing this for our patients.
Thank you. And Dr. Lamana, maybe you can add to this as well, if there is any latest information on vaccines and the immune response for those with certain blood cancers, for example.
Yeah, so we participated in several of these and have published throughout the pandemic. And there continue to be more studies specifically, not only for cancer patients in general, but then even within, depending upon whether they're multi-center, meaning more than one hospital, or institutional-based studies looking at the response to different COVID vaccines, in addition to therapies that we're trying to utilize for cancer COVID patients. So there's lots of studies going on for cancer patients in general, and more data is coming out looking at specific, even the immune response in even specific cancer patients and based on therapies, and trying to break that down and become more granular with understanding this depending upon the patient's cancer and the therapies. So obviously there'll be lots of data that continues to come out over the next couple of years.
Thank you. And Dr. Garza, what is your opinion, or and this question comes from bladder cancer patient community, I can see, if there is any evidence of safety or otherwise for the concurrent administration of a COVID vaccine or a booster vaccine in patients undergoing intravesical BCG immunotherapy for non-muscle invasive bladder cancer. Any opinion that you would like to share, or any evidence that you're maybe aware of?
I have to say that this is not my field of expertise, and this is something that should be discussed with oncologist experts on treating these cancers. And as an example, that informed opinions should be sought from the people that are experiencing the specific cases or the specific pathologies that people are referring to. And generalists or people that have a general opinion about things, maybe this general opinion is not the most correct.
Thank you. And coming back to you, speaking of data, what is the latest data that you might be aware of who should receive a booster shot and when? Do we have any data available on that yet?
Right. So this is, I think that it was a few moments ago that Dr. Lamana said that we are gaining knowledge as the time passes. And this is certainly the case for these booster doses, because we only have information, data that will be useful to make a decision as time passes. So we, as a community, are following up closely as data is accumulated to make the best decisions informed by this data on what are the different groups of the population that most benefit from booster doses at different time points. And this is an evolving scenario where it is likely that additional recommendations will be released over the coming weeks and months as the data becomes available.
Thank you, Dr. Grassa, and thank you, Dr. Lamana, that indeed you have answered. And I think there's another question that's come from the live audience, and I think we have collectively answered it on whether antibody testing can help patients and clinicians determine the need for third or booster vaccines and help patients understand their risk profile. Is this another area that perhaps we don't have enough data and we're learning as the situation evolves?
Regarding antibody tests, I think there is a consensus among most health authorities that, except in very special circumstances, decisions regarding vaccination should not rely on the quantification of antibodies and serologic tests. So certainly these are important tests mainly for research at this stage, but not really to make decisions about a specific person regarding the vaccination.
I can chime in as well about that.
Dr. Lamana?
Yeah, I think that this is obviously for some patients, depending upon where you are, the access to some of these tests is different. And also the question is obviously we're trying to figure out how to best utilize some of these testing approaches. And one shouldn't, I tell my patients that sometimes patients, we have access to a lot of this testing here in New York. And sometimes for psychological reasons, it might be important for somebody to, we sort of talk about the risk benefit ratio of doing an antibody test on our particular patient. But we really shouldn't be making decisions based on that. I tell my patients that it's really important that we're still learning, again, when we talk about the different arms of your immune system, we're still learning about, whether or not somebody, the different immune responses and whether the spike antibody test is really the only important aspect of testing for your immune response. And we know that's not the case. There's data coming out that clearly that there are other arms of our immune system that are important in our defense against COVID-19. And so I think that, patients need to know that they shouldn't change their behavior necessarily or change whether or not they're going to get the vaccine or a booster depending upon their spike antibody level. And I think that it's really important that, I encourage my patients to really talk to us. I think academically, we're trying to understand this particular test. And so we might be doing this in terms of research. And so we're gathering this data on our patients. But until we have that, I don't want patients to change what they're doing or to not obtain a booster or a vaccine because of some of these tests right now.
Thank you. And this links quite nicely to another question that we have received when it comes to conflicting messages that we're seeing all around, and how do we avoid those conflicting messages about the different COVID vaccines and boosters and eligibility and the various rollouts are happening differently. And this is, I will leave it as an open question maybe to anyone who would like to face this. I think the areas that we have received a question was more between medical specialties and also from different levels of public health agencies. And I suppose our patient advocacy groups have a role as well even in addressing this. So just to reiterate the question, so how do we avoid conflicting messages about the different COVID vaccines, boosters, and eligibility? Would anyone like to tackle this question briefly?
I could start
Maybe.
just by saying, use reliable sources. Don't go, the internet is full of nonsense. And like somebody said at the beginning, be very careful with social media. Avoid that. That's people sitting on the loo and being scientific experts. Listen to, go to reliable sources, speak to your team.
Thank you, Dr. Farmer. Anyone else? I think it's quite a clear answer from Dr. Farmer. And I would like to follow up as well from another question from the audience now. It's not specific to vaccines, but may inform patient decisions about getting vaccinated. In your view, are cancer patients less anxious now, from your experience, about COVID than they were at the outset? Dr. Farmer, that's a question for you, and anyone else who would like to chip in as well.
That's quite a complex question. I think, again, you can't generalize. There will be some patients who are still shielding very carefully and others who are much less cautious. I'm thinking of a friend of mine who started shielding way before she was told to, and is now hugging and kissing quite freely of everyone and inviting people into her home. So I think it's important not to generalize. I think certainly in the UK, people in general are less careful because we don't have mandatory mask wearing, for example, in restaurants, public transport, supermarkets like they do in some other countries, and senior political figures are seen without masks. So in general, people are less cautious, but I would say that probably there is amongst our patient group, we are seeing people coming back to the hospital, we're seeing admissions going up, but the majority are still being sensible.
Thank you. And Dr. Laman, I think you may have wanted to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think given what Dr. Farmer said, I think in general, there's a little bit more ease about what's going on now that the vaccines have become available, and also some of the monoclonal antibody therapies, that there's no doubt that we're seeing more folks come back to the clinic and to the hospital. I think that our cancer patients in general, at least here in New York, are still, very much social distancing and using safe practices and mask wearing, and we still have mandates to do so in public places and forums. And so I think patients are still being really relatively conservative in that respect. But I think they're socially being a little bit more gathering with families, other family members who have been vaccinated. So I think there's been a little bit of ease psychologically from that respect. But as Dr. Farmer noticed, there's a range of patients and what they're willing to do. And so certainly there are many patients who are still very much isolating themselves and being very conservative in their approach. But I think in general, there's a hope now that there wasn't before, obviously, vaccination. And so I think it's been a good sign in general.
Thank you. And Dr. Laman, if I may follow up with you on with the question from your specialty, we have received whether vaccine is safe for those already on medications that increase the chance of blood clots.
Sure. I mean, on medications for patients who are already on medications for blood clots, was that
might increase? No, sorry,
yeah,
the medications that might increase the chance of blood clots.
Sure. Okay. So, I mean, obviously, this is something that, probably there's not a whole lot of data. I mean, obviously, the concern that we had with COVID infection is that clearly there are patients who can obtain blood clots. And then obviously there are some therapies that might increase the risk of blood clots as well. But I don't think that we, as far as I'm aware, would not even imagine how the vaccine itself could contribute to that. So no, I don't have any concern about administering the vaccine for my patients who might be on therapies that might be contributable to the advent of some blood clots. So I have I think very little data, but to be frank, I can't even imagine how that would work medically, scientifically. So I have no concerns about administering the vaccine for patients who are on actually any therapy at this point.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I would like to bring in one final question. The discussion is just going so swiftly from the audience now. And the question is, are there different vaccine guidelines for those who have metastatic disease versus primary? Maybe Dr. Dazambuja, would you like to tackle this one?
Yes, sure. No, there is no different protocols for patients with early stage early stage cancer and metastatic cancer. So we do not make any differential. You recommend the vaccines to all patients.
Thank you so much. So now as we wrap up, maybe we can quickly go to each of you for some final thoughts, and my final kind of question to guide that thinking for you is, from each of your standpoints, what are your key concerns when it comes to COVID vaccines for people with cancer, and how can we collectively together address that? So maybe Dr. Grassa, I can go with you first, very briefly. What are your key concerns when it comes to COVID vaccines for people with cancer and how we can address them together?
My main concern is to make sure that people that have cancer, as well as other diseases and even healthy people, to get vaccinated and to have a complete course of vaccination as quickly as possible. And it would be optimal if this could be extended to geographical regions in the world where vaccines are not so widely available as in Europe and North America.
Thank you so much. Dr. Farmer?
I think,
same question.
Yeah, and pretty much same answer really, that it's really important to get the vaccination. It's very important that we as healthcare professionals listen to the reasons why people might be vaccine hesitant and hopefully address that to, shift that to getting the vaccine, but address those fears, address those concerns, because there usually is an answer to them.
Thank you. And Dr. Lamanna, what are your key concerns?
I think given what we've just lived through and the loss of millions of folks around the world, I think it's important to take notice that this was a devastating time, and most of us, if not all, probably have been impacted or affected by someone we know or love who has died from COVID. And I think that as the science, it's actually been an amazing time if we think about all the research and things that are going on dedicated to understanding this virus and how to protect those around the world from this virus. And I think people with cancer are a unique population, and there are others who have immune conditions besides cancer that are also impacted by this virus in general. And so I think that, it's really, really important to understand that there are people working on this that in the medical community that have experience and are gaining experience, but that real true data is coming out and continues to come out every day, and that we should take notice that it is important to go to valid sources. It is important to understand that if there's an impact on what you're seeing from the morbidity and mortality of the virus, it's because of all the stuff that's going on in the medical community. And so please get your vaccine. And for those who have any questions, talk to your medical team, because there are some unique circumstances and we understand that. We really do want to appreciate people's fears and sort of try to figure out ways to overcome their fears to obtain the vaccine, both for themselves, obviously in their immune condition, but also for their loved ones. So any questions, talk to your medical team.
Thank you. And lastly, Dr. Dazambuja, what are your key concerns?
Yeah, I fully agree with what has been said. I think the key concern is to get people vaccinated as soon as possible. They need to get the third dose. In those countries where they didn't have the vaccine yet, the government should try to find a way of vaccinating those people. And if you talk to a colleague that is a little bit reluctant about giving a third dose to the patients, you should discuss with this person and talk the advantages and why we should get vaccinated. I think that there is a lot of work that we can do. We can talk to our patients. It's crucial that you ask about the vaccination of the patients. And if some patients say they are not willing to do the third dose of the vaccination per se, we talk and explain why it's beneficial for them.
Thank you. And I'm afraid we will have to leave it there. I would like to thank you, Dr. Grassa, Dr. Dazambuja, Dr. Lamana and Dr. Fama for your time. It has been wonderful to have you here. And once again, thank you for donating your time to answer these questions that our community has shared with us, and I'm mostly concerned with. I think we have done a good job and at answering most of those questions, but we will do our best to answer any questions that we were not able to cover today, and I'm sure our panelists today will be able to answer those in writing, and we'll be able to share that with everyone afterwards. So now would be the time to go on to our second part of the event today. And last week, Phaedra Charlton, our project manager for Global Cancer Coalitions Network and director of communications and marketing at the World Ovarian Cancer Coalition, sat down with two remarkable women who are working to engage underserved communities and dispel some of the myths about the vaccine in order to increase vaccination rates, and especially in those populations that are disproportionately at higher risk. And while we don't have the time to have a live Q&A here today, like we did just now with our panelists, please do put your questions in the Q&A panel to the right, and we will be sure to come back to you with our guest responses as well afterwards. So our first feature is Sabina Vola-Miller. She's the founder of Unambiguous Science, who is working to combat COVID-19 misinformation and vaccine hesitancy. So can we bring Sabina up on the screen?
Sabina Vola-Miller today joins us from Toronto. She has a background in clinical pharmacology and toxicology and is founder of Unambiguous Science, a platform that aims to make science accessible. Breaking information down in easy to understand posts, Sabina's aim is to help people navigate through the current anti-science discourse. And Sabina is joining us here today with a little presentation on what she's been up to. Sabina?
Hi there, thanks for having me today. I am the founder of Unambiguous Science, as well as the co-founder of the South Asian Health Network. I'm also the co-founder of our family foundation that focuses on making healthcare equitable and accessible for Canadians. I've been countering vaccine myths and disinformation online on social media for several years now. It started when I joined mom groups on Facebook and realized it was just an avalanche of fear-mongering misinformation. I also moderate a large evidence-based parenting group, and I'm part of various vaccine hesitancy groups on Facebook. Unambiguous Science is a science-based platform that I created early in the pandemic. The purpose was really to make science accessible in a way that builds confidence and reduces chaos, especially in these times of what the WHO has termed an infodemic, where we're bombarded with an overwhelming amount of information, and a lot of it, in fact, is false. So I am on several different platforms, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, as well as a standalone website. I use a combination of different strategies to counter vaccine misinformation. A lot of my work focuses on social media because we know that mis and disinformation is exceptionally pervasive and rampant on social media, and also because the possibility of outreach is remarkable. But I also know that everyone is not on social media, and meeting people where they are is important to me. So a lot of my outreach occurs within traditional media platforms, such as TV and radio, ethnic media channels, one-on-one discussions, as well as small group vaccine education sessions. So I'm going to start at the basics here. This is the WHO's 3 C's of vaccine hesitancy model. The first C is most familiar to us. It's confidence, which is not just trust in the effectiveness and safety of vaccines, but importantly also in health systems. And in fact, not just the health systems that deliver these vaccines, but also motivations of policymakers, of government bodies, and more. I will discuss the confidence piece in more detail during this presentation. The second C is complacency. This exists where perceived risks of vaccine preventable diseases are low, and vaccination is not deemed a necessary preventative action. A successful immunization program may paradoxically result in complacency and ultimately hesitancy as people weigh the risks of vaccines against the risks of diseases that are no longer common and the harmful effects of which are easily forgotten. This has definitely played a large role in vaccine hesitancy during the pandemic, where we've been seeing the pushing of a false narrative that COVID-19 is in fact a mild disease. This is absolutely incorrect. The last C is convenience, which is measured by the extent to which physical availability, affordability, and willingness to pay, as well as geographical accessibility, language accessibility, and health literacy affect uptake. While we often deprioritize convenience, what's important to remember that these multiple structural barriers to access is actually one of the primary reasons for suboptimal uptake of vaccines in many marginalized and racialized communities. Vaccine hesitancy really is a spectrum. You have on one hand the very extreme anti-vaxxers who refuse all vaccines, and these are really difficult to convince and frankly exhausting because they use many tactics that are used that are really intended, to be used to defeat you by draining your energy, things such as goalpost changing, sea lining, misrepresenting information rapidly and constantly. So my personal recommendation, when it comes down to someone who's a very staunch anti-vaxxer, is to simply not engage with such individuals. On the other hand of the spectrum, you have those who accept all vaccines on schedule. And then the area in the middle is your continuum of hesitancy, where one can be hesitant about a single vaccine, such as those who don't believe in the flu shot or those who are apprehensive about the HPV vaccine. And also what I commonly see amongst new parents, those who want to space or delay vaccines. It also includes the bulk of the vaccine hesitancy we see with the COVID-19 vaccines. In addition to all of this, there's also another layer that exists, which is actually due to systems and not, in fact, due to the actual vaccines themselves. Okay, so let's go deeper into confidence. Taking a quick pause over here for a quick reflection point. This quote here is by Professor Maya Goldenberg out of the University of Guelph, who is a leading voice on understanding vaccine hesitancy in Canada. She says, "I see vaccine hesitancy as a symptom of poor public trust in scientific institutions and scientific governance." I also want to expand on when I talk about distrust in government and healthcare systems. Racialized communities have distrust with health and government agencies due to a long, painful legacy of racism, discrimination, and even experimentation that they've all experienced firsthand. Overwhelmingly, they feel let down by the government and public health, especially throughout the pandemic. So the reason why I bring this up is because saying something as simple as Health Canada or your regulatory body in your country, considers this vaccine safe doesn't necessarily mean much to racialized communities when they feel that the government and health agencies have not done much to keep them safe during COVID. So what should we do instead? These are a few of the do's and don'ts that I typically fall and ensure that I utilize in all of my ongoing conversations around vaccine confidence. My very first recommendation is to always be empathetic, be kind, and be respectful in all of your discussions, and encourage that open dialogue in a safe space without judgment where people can ask their questions. Remember also that these conversations are rarely one-offs, so keeping an open line of dialogue going is so incredibly critical. Proactively addressing questions and being honest and transparent, especially on things such as side effects, is necessary. Very often, we tend to gaslight concerns on side effects or adverse effects, when in fact being dismissive of them actually does not build confidence. Instead, when we speak openly about adverse effects, while putting them into context of a risk-benefit analysis, it only empowers people to make those confident decisions for themselves. So that's really what we're trying to drive out of some of these discussions that we're having with people who are vaccine hesitant. Always use credible sources and never underestimate the power of the emotional connection and stories. If you can engage them with a story, meet them where they are, everything that you do converse with them goes a lot further than if you're actually using a top-down approach to give them information. And in terms of what we shouldn't do, Don't be dismissive, as I mentioned. Understand that they're coming from a place of fear and anxiety. And very often fear and anxiety is not necessarily logic driven. And so if you are dismissive of these fears and these concerns that they're bringing forward, you lose that opportunity to actually build confidence. Blaming and shaming also alienate, and don't drown in jargon and data, which I know is really difficult, especially for many of us in medicine and academia. The idea here is not to show that you know what you're talking about, but in fact, the idea here is to build confidence. And so speaking to them at a level that they understand where they're not overwhelmed is exceptionally important. And lastly, don't be aggressive. This just makes them dig their heels in further, and in fact, makes them a lot more unapproachable, even in the future. While well-intentioned, a one-size-fits-all top-down approach we've seen exist quite often, especially during this pandemic, has in fact left behind the very groups that have been marginalized throughout the pandemic. So what is really important and really necessary is having those nuanced, culturally sensitive, and tailored approaches. And in terms of how I've sort of put all of this together in the work that we do, the first and foremost step is to be tailored in what you're addressing. So always start by asking what their question is, what are their concerns, what are they most worried about, and then address those specifically. If you're not asking the questions, what ends up happening is you're missing what the root cause of their apprehension is, and you're discussing everything around and surrounding that, which is only going to further overwhelm them because you're giving them information that they don't want at that time and they're not receptive to actually listen to. The second thing that I always try and keep in the back of my mind is having accessibility at the forefront. So this means culturally sensitive materials, especially including different languages, different formats, based on the way people consume information is incredibly important. You need to meet people where they are, and this means using a variety of different mediums. Sticking to one medium very often misses out on a huge percentage of people who simply do not use that medium. So by actually using a variety of different mediums, you're trying to get people where they are in whichever medium that they consume their information. And so again, meet people where they are. Don't ask them to come to you. You need to go to them. What I also always recommend is leveraging the trust and relationships that you have either with your customers, your clients, your patients, the people in your community. All of these things mean so much more, in fact, than even saying something as simple as a regulatory health body has approved a vaccine in your country. In fact, you talking about how you yourself have been vaccinated or you yourself have vaccinated your children ends up playing a much more important role than putting these abstract norms about how that the vaccines were approved through a due diligence process, etc. In fact, what it really comes down to is you leveraging that trust and relationship with the people that you work with, and them understanding that you have their best interests at heart. Along with that, partnering with community and especially BIPOC organizations is incredibly important for two reasons. First of all, you understanding what the concerns are in the community is really important. But second of all, actually using these community partnerships and these partnerships with BIPOC organizations, you're again leveraging the trust that they have with their communities to essentially push out that information that you're really trying to push out in specific communities. And so, for instance, this could be with the work that I do, speaking directly to community health organizations in the South Asian community, speaking to faith leaders in the community. These are all tactics that we all should be employing, again, because we should be meeting people where they are. And lastly, debunk misinformation, because we know very clearly that this works. The longer you allow disinformation to perpetuate, the more pervasive it becomes, and the more it starts impacting people's subconscious as well. If you have any other questions, you are more than welcome to reach out to me. That's my email address, as well as my Twitter handle and my website. And you can find more information, more infographics, anything that you're looking for through these websites as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabina. And once again, if you have any questions, please do feel free to share them with us in the Q&A box, and we will pass those on to Sabina, who will be able to answer those in writing afterwards. So the subject of our second feature is Dr. Linda Odenigbo, who made the headlines in Dayton, Ohio in the United States for her work in the African American and immigrant communities. So over to Linda.
Tonight, Pri-Med is part of a national campaign that went viral called Roll Up Your Sleeves. This campaign aims to address vaccine hesitancy in communities of color with the goal of getting everyone on board for their shots so we can reach herd immunity against COVID-19. Today, Dr. Linda Odenigbo with Pri-Med in Huber Heights, who is part of the campaign, spoke at a panel sponsored by the Nigerian Cultural Organization of Dayton. She addressed myths those in the immigrant and African American community have about the COVID-19 vaccination. She says the history of healthcare discrimination and fast production of the vaccine sparks concerns.
They ask, we've had HIV for a while, there's no vaccine for that. How come this was created in 9 months? So just educating them that the technology itself has been around for over 10 years and was just recently customized for the COVID-19.
Odenigbo clarified it's these doubts and not the fear of deportation that prevent undocumented immigrants from getting vaccinated. Odenigbo also cautioned that time is not on our side, and this campaign hopes to help get the majority of the population vaccinated before new variants mutate into a strain that's not protected by the current vaccines.
We are so pleased that Dr. Odenigbo joins us today as she takes us through her work with African American and immigrant communities in the United States. Linda, can you give us an overview of the work with underserved communities overcoming vaccine hesitancy?
Sure. So with COVID-19, we already know that the underserved community, the communities most hit hard by COVID-19. Mortality highest in our community, morbidity highest, and vaccine hesitancy is also high in our community. So getting the word out, I mean, aside from masking, hand washing, and all the preventative things we can do to prevent getting COVID, one of the big things is that COVID-19 vaccine works. The data shows that. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, there's a lot of misinformation out there about what COVID-19 vaccine does to you. Most of them false. And I think social media has unfortunately helped in getting this, this vaccine hesitancy to a fever high. So we, a group of, doctors of color and people of color got together to find a way to get into our community. We're supposed to be, in most cases, trusted. But with regards to COVID-19, we're sometimes, perceived as, part of the problem by, the people that have concerns about the vaccine. So using other ways to get across to them through church leaders, to the hairdressers. You'll be amazed that some of the hairdressers had better luck than we did in convincing people to get vaccines. Barbers, and we also set up Zoom meetings with our communities. I am also a part of the Nigerian Women Organization here in Dayton, and we had a nice Zoom informative meeting on COVID vaccine and the myths and the facts. And the women had a chance to ask questions in a non-threatening, environment. Sometimes, you think of vaccine hesitancy just in people that are vocal about it. I don't want the vaccine. There's a large, quiet majority that that don't want to ask, don't want to say anything, but they just are not planning to get the vaccine. So those are some of the things that we've done, the Zoom meetings, just information. I mean, it's just trying to break down the misinformation that people have embedded in their minds about the COVID-19 vaccine.
You mentioned trust, and certainly that's a theme that came up in our conversation with Sabina earlier. Do you find that this is really at the core of vaccine hesitancy?
Absolutely. There's always a trust issue, dating back to, years ago with the Tuskegee experiment. I mean, there's always, and then you get information on women of color, having more complications from childbirth. So yes, there's there's a huge trust issue with our community.
So Linda, this issue of trust that's really been brought to the fore by COVID-19 is it a silver lining perhaps that, now that it's really highlighted as an issue for us all to see very clearly, is this an opportunity for communities to come together and really work on that core issue as a result of COVID-19?
Absolutely. It's opened up a lot of conversation about that. And we have also, kind of discussed about, kids of color going more into medicine and more into, science, basically. There are a lot of, well, not a lot, there quite a number of people of color involved in the whole process of vaccine production, and we highlighted them, highlighted the fact that this is not all, just white people telling you to, get this vaccine. You're getting the same, and you'll have people ask me, so is it the same vaccine that they give black and white? Because we actually had a program where, through the Black churches, we had centers where, we targeted people of color to come in and get the vaccine, that they wanted to know if the vaccines were the same for white and black people. That's the level of distrust that we have out there.
So other than trust issues, what have been other key blockages for people to get the vaccine?
Oh, just the misinformation. You hear things like fertility issues in young girls. That has a chip, the government is going to track you with the chip. Anybody that gets the vaccine will be dead in 2 years. All those things are the same thing for the general population, just huge misinformation. And I think also the perceived speed at which the vaccine was produced. And we tried to let them know that this technology, the mRNA technology, has been around for years. There really was just no virus to apply to. So I think the big one is, how come they got the vaccine so quickly? How come, HIV has been around for a while, we don't have the vaccine, and then COVID shows up and we have a vaccine in under 2 years. So those are, some of the things that that are barriers in them getting the vaccine.
As we wrap up, what do you think are the key learnings, the takeaways from your work with underserved communities in the United States?
So with our community, there's a lot of listening that we have to be more patient with our people of color, just because of the history. So we have to listen. We have to make sure we answer questions about what their fears are. And most of all, just, educate is what we can do.
Thank you so much, Linda. A lot of what you said was really an echo of what we heard too from Sabina earlier, that really the most important thing is to really to listen, to be patient, and to focus on education and building trust. So thank you so much for joining us, and all the best success in the future.
Thank you so much, Phaedra. It was great talking with you.
Thank you, Dr. Denibo, and thank you, Phaedra, for leading these wonderful conversations. And we're receiving some comments from the audience live as well, that these grassroots vaccine hesitancy campaigns are so inspiring, and hopefully they will inspire more across the board in our communities. And so finally, we are pleased to welcome Kathy Oliver. She's the chair and founding co-director of the International Brain Tumor Alliance, and also a proud member of the Global Cancer Coalitions Network. She is here to present results from their recent COVID-19 vaccines and brain tumor patient survey. So I hand it over to Kathy.
Thanks very much to the Global Cancer Coalitions Network for inviting me here today to speak about our International Brain Tumor Alliance survey on COVID-19 vaccines and the brain tumor patient experience. Now, fear and uncertainty have always been part of the brain tumor journey for patients and their families. But since mid-March of 2020, when the WHO declared that COVID-19 was a pandemic, that uncertainty and fear have been magnified in ways that none of us could have imagined. The COVID pandemic has threatened every aspect of modern-day life, from countries' economies to social and family activities. The virus has amplified inequalities and created huge shifts in human behavior and interpersonal relationships. It's forced all of us to make daily decisions about how to balance the risk of contracting COVID-19 with meeting our everyday needs. Now, as of November 18th, nearly 255 million confirmed cases of COVID-19 have been reported to the World Health Organization, and there have been over 5 million deaths also confirmed to the WHO. As we all know, the pandemic has led to unprecedented stress on healthcare systems across the globe. During the first 12 weeks alone after the COVID-19 pandemic was announced, the total number of estimated canceled surgical cases worldwide was already over 28 million, with an overall cancellation rate of 72.3%. And here on the slide, you see a very recent Lancet Oncology report of a study involving over 20,000 adults in 61 countries with 15 cancer types, which has revealed how fragile cancer surgery systems are to lockdowns, particularly in lower to middle income countries. At the recent Hybrid European Cancer Summit, which I co-chaired last week in Brussels, the European Cancer Organization, ECO, launched its Time to Act data navigator, which gathers available information to provide data intelligence, which quantifies the enormous impact of COVID-19 on cancer care in Europe. An ECO study in partnership with IQVIA has revealed, for example, that an estimated 1 million cancer cases could be undiagnosed in Europe because of the pandemic. And just a few days ago, data published in the London Times revealed that tens of thousands of operations in England alone have been cancelled during this healthcare crisis. Now, the WHO declared COVID-19 a pandemic on March 11th, 2020, as you'll remember. Shortly after that, the International Brain Tumor Alliance conducted a survey in 7 languages to capture the perspectives of adult and pediatric brain tumor patients and their caregivers across the world. Our first COVID-19 survey brought in just under 2,000 unique responses from 33 countries. These results from this COVID survey number 1 were published as a free access paper in Neuro-Oncology Advances in August 2020. In the summer of 2020, the IBTA undertook a second COVID survey, this time of the brain tumor charity and not-for-profit sector around the world, and how the pandemic had affected their services and operations. And again, this survey number 2 was also published in Neuro-Oncology Advances. In July and August of this year, 2021, the IBTA carried out its third most recent international survey, which collected data on how the coronavirus vaccination programs in different countries have been offered to brain tumor patients. It also looked into COVID-19 testing, which vaccines brain tumor patients have received, vaccine side effects in brain tumor patients, and why some patients had chosen not to be vaccinated. The results of our COVID survey number 3 are still being analyzed. but we do have some preliminary findings, which I'm pleased to be able to share with you today. But please keep in mind that these are just top-line findings from our 39-question survey, and there is still a considerable amount of data to be assessed. According to the WHO COVID-19 dashboard, as of November 18th, nearly 7.5 billion COVID-19 vaccine doses have been administered globally. Of those, just over 4 billion are people vaccinated with 1 dose and 3 billion are people vaccinated with 2 doses. The IBTA survey on brain tumor patients in COVID-19 vaccines was for adults only and was conducted over 2 months this past summer. It was also available in 8 languages. Questions were divided on the survey into these categories: demographics, medical history, patient's COVID vaccination status, decision not to proceed with vaccination, vaccine side effects, and caregiver vaccination status. We had nearly 1,000 unique surveys completed from brain tumor patients in 43 countries. The median age was 45 to 54 years old, and 60% of respondents were female. The 4 top countries from which responses came were the United States, United Kingdom, Japan, and Australia. And the 3 most common brain tumor diagnoses of survey respondents were glioblastoma, meningioma, and astrocytoma. The most common medical comorbidity was epilepsy, followed by hypertension. The majority of respondents had been diagnosed with their brain tumor in the last 5 years. Now, our survey revealed that 69% of brain tumor patients have been tested for COVID-19, and of those who were tested, only 6% have tested positive for the virus. Our survey also revealed that 85% of brain tumor patients have now received 1 or both doses of a COVID-19 vaccine. And the most common vaccine which patients received was the Pfizer jab, followed by the AstraZeneca vaccine. 64% of patients told us that they were prioritized to receive the vaccine, and the most common reason for the prioritization was the fact that they had a brain tumor. In terms of timing between first and second dose of a COVID vaccine, half of brain tumor patients received their second dose in less than 6 weeks from the first dose. At the time they received their vaccines, 1/4 of patients were on active treatment for their brain tumor, with chemotherapy being the most common treatment at the time the patients completed our IBTA survey. According to our survey, 9% of brain tumor patients decided not to get the COVID-19 vaccine. Brain tumor patients' most common concern in relation to this was the vaccine safety, followed by concerns over the efficacy of the vaccine. 32% of our respondents were concerned about the COVID-19 vaccine program and the rollout in their country. And 28% of brain tumor patients who received the vaccine in our survey were not at all worried about contracting the virus. Brain tumor patients reported that their most common side effects from the COVID vaccine were pain in the arm at the vaccine site, tiredness, and headache. 11% of patients had no side effects whatsoever. And very reassuringly, no major side effects were reported in our survey. So what are the key takeaways which we can draw from these very preliminary results of the IBTA survey on COVID-19 vaccines and brain tumor patients? Well, very few patients have tested positive for COVID-19, which is a relief. The majority of brain tumor patients and their caregivers who responded to our survey have now received the COVID-19 vaccine. No major vaccine side effects were reported by any of the respondents, and less than 10% of patients have decided not to get the vaccine, with their largest concern being the safety of the vaccine. So we were very reassured to see that there were no major side effects reported from the vaccine, according to the nearly 1,000 brain tumor patients responding to our survey. Based on data from the first COVID survey that we ran last year, which I mentioned at the start of this presentation, we know that our patient population worldwide wants more specific information from their healthcare providers, charities, and not-for-profits about the interplay between COVID-19 and their brain tumor diagnosis. Therefore, we must continue to provide up-to-date, accessible, high-quality care information and support to this vulnerable population, especially in the era of COVID-19. We'd like to thank all of our brain tumor patients who participated in this survey, as well as the IBTA senior advisors and the Society for Neuro-Oncology COVID-19 Task Force, who all helped us develop and review the survey questions. Thanks also go to brain tumor not-for-profits, charities, and healthcare professionals around the world who helped us disseminate the survey, and of course to our volunteer translators as well. So thank you very much indeed for listening to this presentation.
And thank you so much, Kathy, for sharing the findings of your survey. So before we wrap up, I just wanted to briefly remind you, if you have any questions for Kathy or any previous speakers, you can share them now in the Q&A box. This is the last opportunity to do so, and we'll try our best to get those answered for you. So thank you so much for joining us today for the COVID-19 Vaccines and Cancer event. In the coming days, the video from today's event will be available on our brand new website, globalccn.org. And if you have any questions about this or any other event, please contact us through our website. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event next year. So thank you again to all of our speakers and to the employees of AstraZeneca, whose generous donation helped make today possible. Thank you.